If I told you that the true driving force of civilization was not war, nor religion, nor governments, but commerce, would you believe me? History teaches us that great empires have risen and fallen due to battles and revolutions. But the truth is that behind every conquest, every social transformation, and every technological advancement, there has always been one common factor: the need to exchange goods, resources, and knowledge. Commerce is not just a means of trade. It is the very mechanism that has propelled humanity forward since the dawn of time. It connected civilizations, fueled scientific discoveries, paved the way for progress, and determined who would rule the world in each era. It wasn't armies that made Rome dominate the world. It was its roads and trade routes that spread its influence. It wasn't monarchs that made Europe a global power. It was the great maritime expeditions in search of spices and precious metals. It wasn't military strength that built the United States into the greatest power of the 20th century. It was global commerce flowing through its financial system. From the exchange of salt and spices in ancient times to the era of digital trade and cryptocurrencies, every structure that governs our society has been shaped by those who understood how to control the flow of goods and money. Governments change, ideologies rise and fall, but commerce has always remained the ultimate force driving civilization. In this video, you will discover how commerce created modern society and why it continues to be the most powerful force on the planet. Welcome to Scheffer Vision. Before humans even learned how to write, they already knew how to trade. Commerce is as old as civilization itself, and its origins trace back to the time when the first human groups began exchanging essential goods for survival. Long before coins existed, early transactions were based on direct barter. An excess of hunted meat could be traded for tools, grains, or any other valuable resource. These primitive exchanges laid the foundation for what, centuries later, would become the backbone of the world's great economies. Trade began out of necessity, but it quickly evolved into something much greater. Over time, some communities realized that certain products were more valuable than others. Salt, for example, became one of the earliest highly prized trade goods because it was essential for preserving food. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians used barley as a unit of value, and records show that they were already tracking commercial transactions on clay tablets, even before the invention of formal writing. It was in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt that the first great trade routes emerged. Cities that developed along the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile rivers did not prosper solely due to the fertility of their lands, but because their locations provided access to goods from distant regions. From the very beginning, civilizations understood that wealth did not come only from local production, but also from acquiring goods through trade with other peoples. As cities grew, commerce began to dictate the fate of societies. The Egyptians relied on trade to obtain wood from Lebanon, precious metals from Nubia, and spices from the east. Likewise, the Sumerians traded with civilizations in the Indus Valley, acquiring gemstones, textiles, and other items unavailable in their own region. These transactions not only enriched cities, but also facilitated the exchange of knowledge, technology, and culture. More than just material goods, trade began to shape human behavior itself. The necessity of negotiation led to the first concepts of trust, informal contracts, and even the earliest rudimentary accounting systems. The exchange of goods required communication and understanding between different cultures, accelerating the evolution of languages and written records. The impact of these early transactions was so profound that it determined how the first great civilizations developed. Commerce did not just create wealth, it built cities, expanded empires, and connected societies in ways that no other factor could. What started as a simple exchange of goods would soon become the most powerful tool in history, driving the rise of the first great economies and paving the way for the empires that would dominate the world in the centuries to come. No empire in history ever rose to power solely through military strength. Conquering territories has always been important, but the real foundation of power came from something far more strategic: the control of trade routes. Without a constant flow of wealth, no civilization could remain at the top. Every time an empire expanded, it was commerce that made it prosperous, and every time an empire collapsed, the root cause was directly linked to its ability to keep its trade system functioning. The Phoenicians were among the first to turn commerce into their primary tool of power. Unlike other civilizations that sought to expand their territories through war, they built an empire based on the control of maritime trade routes. With an advanced naval fleet for their time, they established colonies in strategic points across the Mediterranean, such as Carthage, and monopolized the trade of valuable goods, including metals, glass, and the famous Tyrian purple dye. They did not need vast armies to dominate. Controlling the flow of wealth between regions was enough. The Persian Empire took this strategy to another level. Cyrus the Great and his successors expanded their borders by connecting the East and the West under a vast trade network. They created the Persian Royal Road, a system of routes that allowed for the rapid transportation of goods and information throughout the empire. The Persians didn't just conquer territories, they ensured that those territories remained economically viable within their system, securing a steady supply of tributes and valuable goods. Alexander the Great understood this better than anyone. His conquests were not just military but commercial. He did not destroy the cities he conquered, he transformed them into interconnected trade hubs. Each newly conquered territory became a strategic point within a massive economic system linking Greece, Persia, India, and Egypt. His goal was not just to expand his empire, but to ensure it was sustained by the constant flow of wealth generated by trade. Rome was the pinnacle of this mindset. The Roman Empire built its greatness not just through the strength of its legions, but through its absolute control over Mediterranean trade routes. The famous motto Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea, reflected this vision. The trade of Egyptian grain, Spanish olive oil, Eastern silk, and goods from all over Europe fueled the Roman economy. The Romans did not just dominate militarily, they ensured that wealth continuously flowed into Rome. The secret to their power was not just in their weapons, but in the economy that sustained their military machine. And as the ultimate proof that commerce has always been the foundation of power, one only needs to look at what happened when these civilizations declined. The collapse of trade always preceded the collapse of empires. When Rome began losing control over its trade routes, its economy crumbled. The disruption of Egyptian grain supplies, the devaluation of Roman currency, and the fragmentation of trade networks weakened the empire from within, making it vulnerable to barbarian invasions. History's lesson is clear. It is not military force that builds and sustains empires, but the mastery of commerce. The greatest civilizations in history were not those that simply conquered land, but those that knew how to control the flow of wealth and keep their economic systems functioning. Commerce has always been the true force behind the rise and fall of empires. If there was ever a moment in history when commerce became more valuable than any military conquest, it was during the spice trade era. Centuries before oil dominated the global economy, a handful of spices were the most coveted commodities on the planet. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger were worth more than gold in medieval Europe, and this obsession created the intercontinental trade routes that shaped the world as we know it today. By the 15th century, Europeans already knew that these spices were essential, not just for flavoring food, but also for preservation and even medicinal uses. The problem was that they came from distant lands, such as India and the Maluku Islands in Indonesia, and their trade was controlled by Arab merchants and Venetian traders, who charged exorbitant prices. This led entire European nations to embark on a desperate search for direct trade routes to these exotic lands. This race for the spice trade fueled the age of exploration. Portugal and Spain were the first to lead this maritime expansion, launching expeditions to find alternative routes to the riches of the East. In 1498, Vasco da Gama became the first European to reach India by sailing around Africa, opening the sea route that Portugal would monopolize for decades. This discovery gave the Portuguese an enormous advantage over their competitors and turned Lisbon into one of the world's largest commercial hubs. Meanwhile, Spain took a different approach. With Christopher Columbus and later Ferdinand Magellan, the Spanish sought a route to the west, reaching the Americas and discovering new sources of wealth. Although they did not find spices in the New World, the exploitation of silver and gold became a new economic powerhouse for the Spanish Empire. But the Iberian dominance wouldn't last forever. In the 17th century, the Netherlands and England entered the global trade game and completely changed the way business was conducted. This was the period when the first global corporations in history were born. The Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company were the first businesses to operate as multinational giants, funded by private investors and backed by their respective governments. They didn't just transport goods, they controlled territories, commanded private armies, and even negotiated treaties with foreign governments. These companies created the blueprint for corporate capitalism, where private enterprises wielded as much power as nation-states. The Dutch East India Company became the most valuable company in history, with an adjusted value that would surpass trillions of dollars today. Meanwhile, the British East India Company not only monopolized trade between India and Europe, but also laid the foundation for British rule over the Indian subcontinent, a control that would last for more than 2 centuries. The spice monopoly was not just an economic issue, it was a geopolitical weapon. Those who controlled the trade of these essential goods dictated international relations, shaped the fate of empires, and decided which nations would prosper and which would fall behind. The commercial power of these maritime corporations molded the global economy and set the foundation for the financial and business systems we still use today. But like all monopolies, it would not last forever. Over time, spice production began to spread to other parts of the world, reducing its scarcity and therefore its high value. However, the exploitation and domination model created during this period never truly disappeared. What started with spices was later repeated with sugar, coffee, oil, and today with data and technology. Commerce has always found new products to monopolize, and there have always been nations and corporations ready to fight for control. If money rules the world today, it was in the 16th century that this dominance began to take shape. For centuries, trade was based on direct barter. But with the arrival of the great maritime explorations and the discovery of new lands, gold and silver became the primary engines of the global economy. The relentless exploitation of these precious metals in Latin America not only enriched empires but also financed wars, created entire financial systems, and gave rise to the first economic bubbles in history. When the Spanish landed in the Americas, they discovered something that would forever shift the world's balance of power. The gold and silver mines in Mexico and Peru contained wealth on a scale never before seen in Europe. The plundering of the Aztec Empire and the destruction of the Inca Empire secured the Spanish massive amounts of precious metals, which were then transported in enormous fleets to Spain. With the discovery of the Cerro Rico de Potosí in present-day Bolivia, silver extraction reached unprecedented levels, fueling global trade and making Spain the wealthiest nation of the time. But this wealth did not stay solely on the Iberian Peninsula. Gold and silver from the Americas began circulating throughout Europe and Asia, creating an interconnected global economy. Silver mined in Peru was sent to Spain, which used it to pay debts and finance armies. A significant portion of this metal ended up in China, which accepted only silver as payment for its goods, fueling the trade of silk and porcelain. For the first time in history, money began to flow in a truly international manner, linking continents and establishing a global financial system. With so much gold and silver in circulation, Europeans soon realized that hoarding large quantities of precious metals was risky and inefficient. It was during this period that the first modern banks emerged, institutions that allowed merchants to store their gold securely and receive credit notes in return, the earliest versions of paper money. Commercial cities like Amsterdam, Venice, and London became financial hubs, developing systems that would later evolve into the modern banking model. However, this abundance of precious metals also brought an unexpected problem: the creation of the first economic bubbles driven by speculative capital excess. Spain, flooded with silver, spent vast sums on wars and lavish luxuries for the nobility, believing its wealth would never run out. But over time, the oversupply of money led to inflation, currency devaluation, and ultimately, the collapse of the Spanish economy. What seemed like infinite wealth turned into an unsustainable burden. Other European nations learned from Spain's mistake and began channeling this newfound wealth more strategically. England and the Netherlands established stock exchanges and investment systems based on maritime trade and the speculation of future shipments of gold and silver. It was during this period that history saw its first major financial bubble, the Dutch tulip mania, where people invested fortunes in tulip bulbs, convinced their prices would continue to rise indefinitely. When the market collapsed, many lost everything, serving as an early warning that wealth based purely on speculation was unsustainable. The gold and silver era was a turning point. It transformed the medieval economy into a globalized system, created banking institutions that still exist today, and demonstrated how poorly managed wealth could lead entire empires to ruin. Money was no longer just a means of exchange. It became an instrument of power on a global scale, ushering in the age of financial capitalism that continues to shape the world today. If commerce has always been the foundation of civilization, it was during the Industrial Revolution that it ceased to be merely a means of exchange and became the ultimate driver of economic progress. For the first time in history, goods were produced on a massive scale, requiring new distribution systems, transportation networks, and most importantly, financial backing. Trade, which had once been constrained by geography and manual labor, was now propelled by machines, railways, and a modern financial system that ensured its global expansion. The push for this transformation came from the need to produce more in less time. The first major factories emerged in 18th century England, where the mechanization of the textile industry allowed fabrics to be manufactured at an unprecedented scale. With accelerated production, a new challenge arose: how to distribute this massive volume of goods to distant markets? Trade, which had previously relied on caravans and long sea voyages, now required efficient infrastructure to connect factories to consumers. This is how rail networks became the backbone of the new global economy. If goods had previously taken weeks to reach other cities or ports, they could now be transported in just days. This multiplied the reach of commerce, allowing industrialized products to reach parts of the world that had previously had no access to them. The expansion of railways in the United States, Europe, and British colonies such as India not only strengthened the economy, but also redefined global power dynamics. Those who controlled the rail networks controlled the flow of goods, and as a result dominated global trade. However, this industrialized economy brought with it another urgent necessity: money to fund its expansion. The old model of small-scale merchants and individual traders was no longer enough to sustain the gigantic scale of new industries. This was the moment when modern banks emerged to play a central role in the economy. Entrepreneurs like J.P. Morgan in the United States and the Rothschild family in Europe realized that the future of money lay in financing the infrastructure necessary for global trade. Banks began issuing massive loans to build railroads, ports, factories, and entire cities worldwide. Bank credit enabled industries to grow exponentially, and those who controlled the flow of capital became the true architects of the new economic order. It was during this period that financial institutions that still dominate the global economy today were founded. Banks like J.P. Morgan Chase, HSBC, and Deutsche Bank were created to finance the new era of commerce, quickly becoming powerful entities with direct influence over governments and corporations. They didn't just manage money,
they dictated the rules of the game.
The Industrial Revolution was not just a revolution in production. It was a revolution in global trade and the financial system that sustains it. The world transitioned from an economy based on limited exchanges to one driven by mass circulation of goods, powered by modern infrastructure and structured financial capital. Commerce, now globalized, was no longer just a tool for progress. It became the very definition of power. Commerce has always driven the growth of civilizations, but it was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that it reached an unprecedented scale. With the Industrial Revolution producing goods in massive quantities, the economic model needed to expand beyond national borders. This was the moment when capitalism evolved into something much greater: a globalized structure fueled by free trade, mass consumption, and the dominance of large corporations. With the rise of free trade, national barriers began to fall. International markets became essential for distributing industrial production and securing raw materials to sustain economic growth. The concept of trade was no longer just about neighboring countries exchanging goods. It became a complex network linking economies across continents. Products manufactured in England were sold in the United States, cotton from India supplied textile mills in Europe, and oil from the Middle East began fueling the new industries emerging worldwide. Global trade was no longer a trend, it was a necessity for the new economic order. However, this expansion brought with it a major problem: the first large-scale global economic crises. The interconnection of markets meant that a collapse in one country could trigger a domino effect across multiple regions. The Panic of 1873 was one of the first examples of this new dynamic. Banks and investors poured enormous sums of money into industrial expansion, particularly in railroads, believing that demand would never end. But when the market became oversaturated and investments collapsed, what began as a financial crisis in the United States quickly spread to Europe, proving that global trade also meant global crises. In the 20th century, the United States emerged as the dominant economic power. With vast natural resources, a growing population, and an efficient industrial system, the country became the engine of global capitalism. During World War I, the USA supplied resources to war-torn European nations, solidifying its position as the new economic powerhouse. But it was after World War II that American supremacy became undeniable. The US dollar became the world's primary trade currency, and the American economy directly influenced global markets. With this new reality, mass consumption became the core of modern capitalism. If commerce had once focused on meeting basic needs, It was now driven by desire and marketing. The mass production model depended on a consumer base that was constantly buying new products. Companies heavily invested in advertising, creating trends and psychological incentives for people to keep spending. Trade was no longer just a transaction, it became a tool for social manipulation. In this new environment, large corporations took control. If trade had once been dominated by merchant families and bankers, now it was industrial giants and multinational companies that set the rules. Companies like General Motors, Ford, Coca-Cola, and Unilever became symbols of globalization, spreading their products and influence to every corner of the world. International trade was no longer about the exchange of essential goods, it was about the creation of consumer markets on a global scale. Capitalism, which had started as a system based on free competition and economic growth, had now evolved into something far more powerful. It was no longer just an economic system, it had become a global domination model. Whoever controlled trade controlled the world. The economy was no longer dictated solely by governments, it was shaped by corporations and financial institutions that dictated the rules of the market. The explosion of capitalism and globalized trade redefined how nations interact and how wealth is distributed. Money now flowed across borders effortlessly, and those who knew how to move it became the true rulers of the world. Since the dawn of civilization, commerce has been one of the main forces behind the rise of empires and the development of economies. But what many fail to realize is that trade can also be a weapon. Throughout history, those who controlled the flow of goods, currency, and natural resources have had the power to determine the fate of entire nations. No army can fight without supplies, no economy can grow without access to markets, and no nation can thrive in isolation. Great powers have always understood this, and instead of relying solely on military force, they learned to use trade as a tool for political and economic domination. Trade sanctions are one of the clearest examples of this strategy. Instead of invading territories or launching direct attacks, world powers have used economic strangulation to weaken their enemies, blocking access to essential markets and restricting the import and export of strategic goods. This tactic has been used countless times throughout history to cripple adversaries without firing a single shot. During World War I, global trade was restructured to meet the demands of the warring nations. Naval blockades were implemented to cut off enemy nations from food and raw materials, forcing them to ration resources and crippling their economies. The United Kingdom used its navy to block supply routes to Germany, while the Germans retaliated by sinking British commercial ships with submarines. This economic blockade was one of the factors that led to Germany's surrender, proving that commerce could be as destructive as any weapon of war. In World War II, the role of trade as a weapon became even clearer. Even before the fighting began, the United States imposed sanctions on Japan, cutting off its access to oil and other essential raw materials. Without these resources, the Japanese economy was left extremely vulnerable, which became one of the key reasons for the attack on Pearl Harbor. In other words, trade, or the lack of it, became the trigger for one of the most devastating conflicts in history. But if there was any doubt that commerce could be weaponized, the Cold War solidified this reality. For decades, the United States and the Soviet Union did not engage in direct battles, but instead waged an economic and trade war. The US imposed embargoes on the communist bloc, cutting off the Soviet Union's access to technology and restricting its ability to participate in global markets. Meanwhile, the USSR tried to expand its influence by offering trade agreements, resources, and financial aid to third world nations willing to reject American influence. The final blow in this economic war came in the 1980s, when the US, in alliance with Saudi Arabia, dramatically increased oil production, causing prices to plummet. Since the Soviet Union relied heavily on oil exports to sustain its economy, this price collapse weakened an already fragile system. The resulting economic decline was one of the key factors behind the dissolution of the Soviet Union, proving once again that controlling trade can be as powerful as any army. Today, commerce continues to be used as a weapon of war and political dominance. Sanctions against countries like Russia, Iran, and North Korea are clear examples of how global powers still use trade to weaken their adversaries without engaging in direct conflict. What is undeniable is that trade has never been just about the exchange of goods and services. It has always been a strategic tool, a way to reshape the balance of power and ensure that some nations dominate the global stage while others are economically suffocated. In war and politics, those who control the flow of money and goods never need to fire a single bullet to win. Commerce has always been in constant evolution, but no transformation has been as fast and profound as the digital revolution. For centuries, the exchange of goods and services required physical presence, travel, and intermediaries. Today, transactions happen in seconds, from anywhere in the world. The internet has destroyed barriers, eliminated middlemen, and created a new economic model where information, data, and technology are the most valuable commodities. With the rise of e-commerce, businesses that once depended on physical stores have expanded to global operations. A small merchant who previously sold only to their local town can now sell to the entire world. Platforms like Amazon, Alibaba, and eBay have not only transformed retail, but have completely redefined the consumer experience. Power is now in the hands of those who control the technology and algorithms that connect sellers and buyers. But the digital revolution didn't stop there. With the rise of cryptocurrencies, the very concept of money is being challenged. The traditional financial system, which has always relied on banks and governments to mediate transactions, now faces the possibility of a decentralized future. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other cryptocurrencies have emerged as alternatives to conventional money, allowing for direct transactions without the need for banks or regulatory authorities. This new system still faces resistance, particularly from governments that fear losing control over the economy. But the reality is that cryptocurrencies have already become an unstoppable force. Billions of dollars circulate daily in this new market, and major companies have already started accepting digital currencies as payment. Banks and financial institutions, which have monopolized money for centuries, now face a choice: adapt or become obsolete. As digital money solidifies, another silent force is reshaping the economy: automation and artificial intelligence. If the Industrial Revolution replaced manual labor with machines, the digital revolution is replacing professionals across industries with intelligent algorithms. Entire sectors are being automated, from customer service to financial management, and the trend suggests that human labor will increasingly be replaced by smart systems. The impact of this on global commerce will be immense. Companies that once relied on large workforces are now operating with smaller teams, while machines and software take over most of the work. Production costs are dropping dramatically, but this also raises a crucial question. If machines do everything, who will be the consumers of the future? The world is heading toward a new economic model, where data is the new currency and artificial intelligence controls the flow of trade and consumption. The commerce of the future will not be dominated solely by those who sell the most, but by those who control the technology that connects businesses and customers. We are at a critical turning point. The internet has removed physical barriers to trade, cryptocurrencies are challenging the traditional financial system, and automation is redefining work and production. The game has completely changed, and the only certainty is that the future of commerce will belong to those who can adapt the fastest to the new rules. Commerce is not just a means of exchange, it is the backbone of human civilization. From the first trade routes in Mesopotamia to the vast global networks controlled by algorithms, trade has always been the true engine of progress and power. Those who understood and mastered economic flows have always been the ones who set the rules of the world. The most powerful empires in history were not just those that conquered land, but those that controlled what moved within it. The Phoenicians turned maritime trade into their greatest weapon. The Persians created the first great network of trade roads. Rome used commerce to sustain its vast empire. In modern times, the great European powers expanded their dominance through colonies and trade companies. Commerce didn't just enrich these nations, it determined their survival. Time passed, methods changed, but the logic remained the same. Gold and silver from the Americas fueled the creation of modern banks. Railroads connected markets and created billionaires. Industrialization and mass consumption gave rise to megacorporations. Trade has always been controlled by a few, and these few have always been the true architects of the global economic system. Information has always been more valuable than money itself. Those who anticipated crises, understood trends, and acted before others were always ahead. This was true for the bankers who mastered financial flows during the Industrial Revolution, the investors who profited from market crashes, and the tech giants who now control the world's data. Information has always been the real asset. Crises are not the end, they are opportunities for those who know how to play the game. Commerce has always been cyclical. Financial bubbles of the past destroyed fortunes, but they also created new empires for those who positioned themselves correctly. The tycoons who ruled Wall Street, the banks that survived economic collapses, and the investors who made the right bets in times of crisis all understood this rule. Wealth is not just in stability, it's in the ability to see beyond chaos. Real power has never been in the hands of governments. It has always belonged to those who control the flow of money. Governments change, political systems collapse, but commerce remains. During World War I and World War II, it was banks and corporations that financed conflicts and rebuilt nations. During the Cold War, economic sanctions and market control helped bring down the Soviet Union. And today, those who truly run the world are not presidents or parliaments, but mega corporations, central banks, and global financial networks. The digital revolution has changed the game again. Now, whoever controls data controls markets. Money is no longer just paper. It's encrypted codes moving through decentralized systems. Cryptocurrencies challenge the traditional financial order, while artificial intelligence is beginning to decide where and how money should flow. We are witnessing the rise of a new era of commerce, and the rules are still being written. The big question is, will you just watch the game, or will you learn how to play it? History teases us that there will always be winners and losers in the world of trade. The difference between the two is not luck. It's knowledge and strategic vision. If you understood the importance of this topic, you already know what to do. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below which lesson impacted you the most. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how the world really works. This was another video here on Scheffer Vision. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.